In the rugged mountains north of Madrid, there sits a palace that looks more like a fortress than a home. It is called El Escorial. It is a massive square of gray granite rising from the dry earth like a tombstone. It has thousands of windows, but they let in very little light. The corridors are cold and silent. In the center of the stone labyrinth sits a small bedroom. It is Spartan and simple, with bare walls and a hard bed. From this tiny room, a man ruled the world. His name was Philip II of Spain, and he was the most powerful human being on the face of the earth. He controlled Spain and Portugal. He controlled the Netherlands and huge parts of Italy. He controlled the Philippines and the spice routes of Asia. And most importantly, he controlled the Americas. From the silver mines of Mexico to the mountains of Peru, the wealth of the New World flowed into his hands. He was the master of the first empire on which the sun never set. To his enemies, he was a monster. The English called him the demon of the South. The Dutch called him a tyrant. But to his bankers, he was something even worse. He was the world's worst borrower. And we often think of history as a game of generals and kings. We think of battles and treaties. But the story of Philip II is a story about money. It is a story about the illusion of wealth. It is the story of a man who earned more gold and silver than any monarch in history, and yet somehow managed to die completely broke. It is the story of a king who went bankrupt not once, not twice, but 9 times. And in doing so, he destroyed the economy of Europe and set the stage for the decline of the Spanish Empire. To understand how the richest man in the world lost everything, we have to look at what he inherited. Philip was born into the House of Habsburg. This was the dynasty that had married its way to global dominance. His father was the Emperor Charles V, a man who spent his entire life fighting wars against the French, the Ottomans, and the Protestants. Charles was a warrior king. He was always on horseback, moving from one battlefield to the next. But wars cost money, immense amounts of money. Charles paid for his wars by borrowing. He borrowed from the great banking families of Germany, particularly the Fuggers of Augsburg. When Charles abdicated the throne in 1556, he was an exhausted and broken man. He retreated to a monastery to die, leaving the empire to his son Philip. But he left Philip something else, too. He left him a mountain of debt. When Philip put the crown on his head, the Spanish crown already owed millions of ducats to the bankers. The interest payments alone were eating up the majority of the royal income. Philip did not inherit a fortune. He inherited a mortgage. But Philip was optimistic. He had something his father did not have. He had Potosi. In the high Andes of modern Bolivia, the Spanish had discovered a mountain made of silver. It was the largest strike of precious metal in human history. The indigenous people were enslaved and forced to work in the mines. They died by the thousands to pull the silver from the rock. This silver was melted down into bars, stamped with the royal seal, and loaded onto galleons. Once a year, the treasure fleet would sail from the Caribbean to Seville. When the fleet arrived, the docks would groan under the weight of the bullion. It was a river of silver flowing straight into Philip's pocket. Philip believed that this river would never run dry. He believed that God was on his side, and that the silver was a divine gift to help him defend the Catholic faith. This belief was his fatal flaw. Because he thought his income was infinite, he spent money as if there were no tomorrow. He did not act like a man in debt. He acted like a man who had won the lottery. His first act as king was to continue his father's war against France. The French were the traditional enemies of the Habsburgs. The war was brutal and expensive. Philip assembled a massive army in the Netherlands to attack France from the north. In 1557, his army met the French at the Battle of St. Quentin. It was a glorious victory for Spain. The French army was crushed. The road to Paris lay open. Philip was the master of Europe. But victory is expensive. The soldiers needed to be paid, the suppliers needed to be paid, and the bankers who had lent the money to raise the army were asking for their interest. Philip looked at his treasury and found it empty. The silver fleet from America had been delayed by storms. The tax revenues from Castile had already been spent 3 years in advance. The king of the world was insolvent. In 1557, just 1 year after taking the throne, Philip II declared the first sovereign bankruptcy in modern history. It was a shock that rang across Europe. He did not call it a bankruptcy, of course. Kings do not go bankrupt. He called it a suspension of payments. He issued a decree stating that all the short-term loans he had taken from the bankers were now converted into long-term bonds called juros. This might sound like a technicality, but it was a catastrophe for the bankers. The short-term loans, called asientos, carried high interest rates and were supposed to be paid back quickly. The bankers relied on that cash flow to pay their own depositors. By converting them into long-term bonds, Philip was essentially saying, I will not pay you back now. I will pay you back over the next 50 years at a much lower interest rate. Well, the impact was devastating. The great banking house of the Fuggers, which had financed the Habsburg rise to power, was crippled. They had lent millions to Charles and Philip, trusting in the word of the emperor. Now they held pieces of paper that were worth a fraction of their face value. Anton Fugger, the head of the family, wrote despairing letters to his agents. He realized that the Habsburgs were a bottomless pit. The German banking dominance began to fade, replaced by a new group of sharks who thought they were smarter. The Genoese, the bankers from Genoa and Italy, were different. They were tough, calculating, and less sentimental than the Germans. They looked at Philip's bankruptcy and saw an opportunity. They knew Philip needed money to keep his empire running. They knew he couldn't survive without them. So they offered him new loans, but at even higher interest rates and with stricter conditions. They demanded control over the salt mines and the sales taxes of Spain as collateral. They essentially became the repo men of the empire. Philip accepted their terms. He had no choice. He had wars to fight. The biggest war of his life was just beginning. In the northern part of his empire lay the Netherlands. These were 17 wealthy provinces that were the center of trade and industry in northern Europe. They were also becoming increasingly Protestant. Philip was a devout Catholic. He believed that it was his sacred duty to stamp out heresy. He introduced the Inquisition to the Netherlands. He burned heretics at the stake. He stripped the local nobles of their power. The result was the Dutch Revolt. In 1566, the people of the Netherlands rose up. They smashed the statues of the saints in the Catholic churches. They attacked the Spanish garrisons. Philip was furious. He decided to crush the rebellion with an iron fist. He sent his toughest general, the Duke of Alba, with an army of 10,000 veterans to Brussels. The Duke of Alba was a terrifying figure. He set up a tribunal known as the Council of Blood. He executed thousands of people, including the highest nobles of the land. He imposed a new tax called the 10th penny, which demanded 10% of every transaction. The tax destroyed the Dutch economy and united the people against Spain. The revolt turned into a war known as the 80 Years' War. For Philip, this war was a financial black hole. The Netherlands were thousands of miles away from Spain. To get soldiers there, he had to march them along a route known as the Spanish Road, which went from Italy over the Alps and up through Germany. Every step of the way cost money. The soldiers needed food, they needed boots, they needed powder, and they needed their wages. The Spanish soldiers were the best in the world, but they were mercenaries. They fought for pay, not for patriotism. If the pay didn't arrive, they stopped fighting. And because of Philip's financial chaos, the pay rarely arrived on time. The history of the Dutch Revolt is a history of mutinies. The Spanish army would win a great battle and then sit down and refuse to move until the gold arrived. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, a new threat was rising. The Ottoman Empire was expanding westward. Their fleets were raiding the coasts of Italy and Spain. They were capturing Christian ships and enslaving thousands of people. Philip saw himself as the defender of Christendom. He had to build a navy to stop the Turks. Navies are even more expensive than armies. A galley ship requires hundreds of rowers who have to be fed every day. It requires timber, pitch, tar, and cannon. Philip poured millions of ducats into the shipyards of Barcelona and Naples. In 1571, he assembled a massive fleet known as the Holy League. Under the command of his half-brother, Don John of Austria, the fleet sailed to meet the Turks. They met at the Battle of Lepanto. It was the largest naval battle in history up to that point. Hundreds of ships smashed into each other. Tens of thousands of men died. The sea turned red with blood. Spain won a crushing victory. The Ottoman fleet was destroyed. Philip was hailed as the hero of Europe. The Pope ordered bells to be rung in every church. But victory at Lepanto did not bring money. It just brought more bills. The fleet had to be repaired. The sailors had to be paid. And the Dutch were still rebelling. The cost of fighting two wars at once on two different fronts was unsustainable. The silver from America was flowing in at record levels, but it was flowing out even faster. Philip was spending the silver before it even arrived in Seville. He was borrowing against future fleets. He was essentially using a payday loan service to run an empire. By 1575, the situation was critical again. The Duke of Alba had failed to crush the Dutch. Philip replaced him with a new commander, but he sent him with no money. The debt had ballooned to impossible levels. The Genoese bankers, seeing that Philip was overextended, refused to lend him any more cash. They closed their purses. On September 1st, 1575, Philip declared his second bankruptcy. He suspended payments to the bankers again. He canceled the licenses of the Genoese bankers, preventing them from doing business in Spain. He tried to bully them into giving him better terms. It was a high-stakes game of chicken. Philip thought he could force the bankers to bend, but he forgot that his army in the Netherlands was waiting for their pay. The result was one of the greatest tragedies of the 16th century. The Spanish soldiers in the Netherlands had not been paid for months. They were starving and angry. When the news of the bankruptcy arrived, they realized that no money was coming. They snapped. They decided to pay themselves. In November 1576, the Spanish army marched on the city of Antwerp. Antwerp was the richest city in northern Europe. It was the commercial capital of the world, a place of beauty and culture. The Spanish soldiers stormed the city. They burned the houses. They murdered the men. They raped the women. They tortured the merchants to find where their gold was hidden. It was known as the Spanish Fury. 7,000 citizens of Antwerp were massacred. The city was reduced to a smoking ruin. The sack of Antwerp destroyed the commercial center of the Netherlands and sent a wave of horror through Europe. It also destroyed any chance of Philip winning the hearts and minds of the Dutch people. Before the sack, there were still Catholics in the Netherlands who supported the king. After the sack, everyone united against the Spanish monsters. The bankruptcy of 1575 had cost Philip his reputation and his hold on the Netherlands. He eventually reached a deal with the bankers, but the damage was done. He had to agree to pay the soldiers their back wages. But to do so, he had to take out even more loans at even higher interest rates. The cycle of debt was tightening around his neck like a noose. You would think that after 2 catastrophic bankruptcies, Philip would learn his lesson. You would think he would cut his spending, stop his wars, and try to balance his books. But Philip was not a man who compromised. He was a man of absolute conviction. He believed that he was doing God's work and that God would provide. He viewed the bankruptcies not as failures of policy, but as tests of his faith. So instead of shrinking his ambitions, he expanded them. In 1580, the King of Portugal died without an heir. Philip was the closest relative. He saw a chance to unite the entire Iberian Peninsula under one crown. He launched an invasion of Portugal. It was a swift and successful campaign. He marched into Lisbon and crowned himself King of Portugal. This was the zenith of his power. He now controlled the Portuguese Empire as well as the Spanish Empire. He controlled the African coast, the trading posts of India, and the Spice Islands of Indonesia. He controlled Brazil. He was the master of the oceans. But with new territory came new costs. The Portuguese Empire was crumbling and under attack by the Dutch and English. Philip now had to pay to defend colonies on the other side of the world. He had doubled his assets, but he had tripled his liabilities. And then there was England. The English Queen Elizabeth I was a thorn in Philip's side. She was a Protestant heretic. She supported the Dutch rebels, sending them money and soldiers, and she allowed her pirates, men like Francis Drake, to attack Philip's treasure fleets. Drake raided the Spanish coast and stole silver from the galleons. He was humiliating the greatest king on earth. Philip decided that he had to deal with England once and for all. He began to plan the enterprise of England. We know it as the Spanish Armada. It was to be the greatest invasion force ever assembled, a massive fleet of 130 ships carrying 30,000 soldiers. They would sail up the English Channel, link up with the Spanish army in the Netherlands, and land in Kent. They would march on London, capture Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism to England. The cost of the Armada was astronomical. It required deforestation of whole regions of Spain to build the ships. It required thousands of cannons to be cast. It required tons of biscuit and salt pork to be baked and packed. Philip micromanaged every detail. He sat in his small room in the Escorial, counting the barrels of wine and the pounds of powder. He calculated the cost of every nail and every rope. To pay for it, he drained the treasury dry. He borrowed every penny he could from the Genoese. He begged the Pope for a subsidy. He squeezed the Spanish taxpayers until they bled. He bet the entire house on this one roll of the dice. He believed it could not fail because it was a crusade. In 1588, the Armada set sail. It was a magnificent sight, a floating city of castles. But from the moment it left port, things went wrong. The food began to rot in the barrels because the wood was green, the water went bad, and the English were waiting. The English ships were smaller but faster and had better guns. They harassed the Armada up the channel. Then came the fire ships off Calais. The Spanish formation broke. The fleet was scattered. And then the wind. The Protestant wind blew them north. The Armada was smashed against the rocks of Scotland and Ireland. Half the ships were lost. Thousands of men drowned. The great enterprise was a total disaster. When the news reached Philip in the Escorial, he did not rage. He simply stared at the wall. He said, "I sent my ships to fight against men, not against the winds and waves of God." But the bankers were not interested in the winds of God. They wanted their money. The Armada had cost 10 million ducats. It was money that Philip did not have. The loss of the ships was a financial catastrophe. The investment was at the bottom of the ocean. As we end the first part of the story, we see Philip at a crossroads. He is aging. He is sick with gout. His great gamble has failed. His debts are mounting. The silver from America is still arriving. But it is not enough to plug the hole. The bankers are circling like vultures. The empire is stretched to the breaking point. But Philip does not stop. He cannot stop. He is trapped in a prison of his own making, a prison built of gold and debt. In the next part, we will see how the obsession with war drove him to intervene in France, leading to the final and most devastating collapse. We will see how the influx of silver actually destroyed the Spanish economy from within, and we will witness the lonely death of the man who owned the world, but could not pay his bills. The failure of the Spanish Armada in 1588 should have been a wake-up call. It was a military and financial disaster that wiped out a decade of revenue. But for Philip II, it was merely a setback in his divine mission. He believed that God was testing his resolve. Instead of cutting his losses, he doubled down. He ordered the rebuilding of the fleet. He ordered new taxes on the peasants of Castile. He ordered his diplomats to find new sources of credit. The man was an addict, and his drug was imperial ambition. In the 1590s, Philip made a decision that would seal the fate of his finances. He decided to intervene in the French wars of religion. France was tearing itself apart in a civil war between Catholics and Protestants. The Protestant leader, Henry of Navarre, was winning. Philip was terrified of a Protestant king sitting on the throne of France right next to his borders. He believed it would infect his own kingdom with heresy. So he ordered his army in the Netherlands, which was already fighting the Dutch, to turn south and invade France. This was strategic suicide. By diverting his troops, he gave the Dutch rebels a chance to recover and retake territory. He was fighting a war on two fronts with Clear's throat resources barely sufficient for one. And now he opened a third front. He sent money and troops to the Catholic League in Paris. He effectively put the entire French Civil War on his payroll. The cost was staggering. Spain was now paying for an army in the Netherlands, a navy in the Atlantic, and a proxy war in France. The expenditure was 3 times the total income of the crown. To keep the machine running, Philip had to resort to increasingly desperate financial tricks. He began to debase the currency. For centuries, the Spanish currency had been the envy of Europe. The silver real and the gold escu were the standard by which all other money was measured. But inside Spain, Philip introduced a new coin called vellon. It was made of copper mixed with a tiny amount of silver. It was fiat money, junk currency used to pay local bills, while the real silver was sent abroad to pay the bankers and the armies. This caused massive inflation within Spain. The price of bread skyrocketed. The poor were pushed to the brink of starvation. The middle class was wiped out. But Philip didn't care about the domestic economy. He cared about the geopolitical game. He was playing chess on a continental scale, and the Spanish people were just pawns to be sacrificed. The Genoese bankers who had replaced the Germans were now the masters of Spain. They controlled the ports. They collected the taxes. They dictated the terms. They knew Philip was insolvent, but they kept lending him money because the interest rates were so high that it was worth the risk. They developed a system called the fius de Besançon, which were financial fairs where they traded credit notes. They created a bubble of paper debt that floated above the Spanish economy. But bubbles always burst. In 1596, the inevitable happened. The silver fleet from America was smaller than expected. The wars in France were dragging on with no victory in sight. The English sacked the city of Cadiz, burning another Spanish fleet in the harbor. Philip reached into his treasury and found nothing, not a single ducat. On November 29, 1596, Philip declared his third bankruptcy. It was the most devastating one yet. This time, he did not just suspend payments. He decreed that the loans he'd taken from the bankers were illegal. He claimed that the bankers had charged us interest rates, and therefore he had no moral obligation to pay them back. It was a shocking act of royal theft. He seized the revenues that had been pledged to the bankers. He confiscated the silver that belonged to private merchants. He effectively nationalized the financial system to save his regime. The banking houses of Genoa shook to their foundations. Many went bust. The credit of Spain, which was already damaged, was now completely destroyed. No one in Europe would lend a penny to Philip without collateral that they could physically hold. The bankruptcy of 1596 marked the end of the Spanish Golden Age. It paralyzed the army. In the Netherlands, the Spanish troops once again mutinied for lack of pay. This time, the mutiny allowed the Dutch leader, Maurice of Nassau, to capture key cities. The Spanish dominance in the north was broken forever. In France, Henry of Navarre converted to Catholicism, famously saying, "Paris is well worth a mass," and united the country against Spain. Philip's intervention had failed. He had spent millions to stop a Protestant king only to see that king convert and defeat him. Anyway, Philip was now an old man. He was dying. He spent his final years in the Escorial, rotting in his bed. He suffered from terrible ulcers and gout. He was in constant pain. As he lay dying, he looked at the accounts of his kingdom. He saw the ruin he had caused. He had inherited a debt of 20 million ducats. He was leaving a debt of 100 million ducats. He had taxed his subjects into poverty. He had wasted the wealth of the Indies. He summoned his son, the future Philip III, to his bedside. He told him, "I meant to leave you a rich kingdom, but I leave you a poor one." It was a rare moment of honesty. On September 13th, 1598, Philip II died. He held a crucifix that had belonged to his father and passed away in the dark stone room he had built. But the story of Philip's bankruptcies is not just a story about one man's bad decisions. It is a story about a fundamental economic paradox. How could the owner of the silver mines be poor? How could the nation with the most money have the worst economy? Economists today call this the resource curse, or the Dutch disease, although in this case, it was the Spanish disease. The influx of silver from the Americas was supposed to make Spain rich. Instead, it destroyed Spain's industry. Because silver was so plentiful in Spain, prices were high. This meant that Spanish goods like wool and cloth were expensive compared to goods from England or France. It was cheaper for a Spaniard to buy cloth made in London than cloth made in Toledo. So the silver didn't stay in Spain. It flowed right through Spain. It went to English merchants, French manufacturers, and Italian bankers. Spain became a funnel. They did the hard work of mining the silver and transporting it across the ocean, but the rest of Europe got to keep it. The Spanish economy became hollow. They stopped making things. They neglected their agriculture. They relied entirely on the treasure fleet. While England and the Dutch Republic were building industries, creating joint stock companies, and developing banking systems, Spain was just spending cash. They were like a lottery winner who buys fancy cars and big houses but does not invest in a business. When the cash stopped flowing, they had no income source to fall back on. The bankruptcies of Philip II in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596 were the milestones of this decline. Each one represented a failure to adapt. Each one ruined the credit of the state and forced the king to sign away more of his sovereignty to foreign creditors. By the end of his reign, the tax revenue of Spain was owned by foreigners before it was even collected. The legacy of these defaults was long-lasting. It created a culture in Spain where productive work was undervalued and government service or the church were seen as the only respectable careers. The hidalgo, the minor noble who owned nothing but his pride and his sword, became the symbol of the age. Don Quixote, written a few years later as the perfect metaphor for Philip's Spain, a delusional knight fighting imaginary giants while his real life crumbles around him. Meanwhile, the bankers learned their lesson. The Fuggers and the Genoese were ruined, but the financial center of Europe moved north. It moved to Amsterdam. The Dutch, who had fought Philip for 80 years, learned from his mistakes. They built a system based on trade, not plunder. They founded the Bank of Amsterdam and the Dutch East India Company. They invented modern capitalism. The wealth that Philip had wasted was picked up by his enemies. The final irony of Philip's Scythe is the note found in the cargo hold of his ships. The visual image of a galleon arriving with an IOU is not far from the truth. In the later years of his reign, the Silver Fleet was often fully mortgaged before it even left Havana. The king would stand on the docks waiting for the ships, praying they hadn't sunk, knowing that every bar of silver being unloaded already belonged to someone else. He was the CEO of the world's largest company, and he couldn't make payroll. Philip II is a warning from history. He proves that money is not wealth. Silver and gold are just metal. True wealth comes from productivity, from industry, and from a sound financial system. You cannot conquer the world on credit. You cannot outspend your mistakes. Even if you own the mines of Posse, even if you rule the oceans, eventually the bill comes due, and if you cannot pay the repo, man comes for your empire. Spain would continue to be a great power for another century, but the rot had set in. The subsequent kings of Spain would declare bankruptcy again and again in 600, 627, 647. It became a habit, but it was Philip the Prudent, the serious man in black, who started the cycle. He built the Escorial as a monument to God, but he left it as a tombstone for the Spanish economy. The king who went bankrupt 9 times proved that in the game of empires, the accountant is mightier than the general. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.